on the two pharmacy retailers, Clicks Group and Dis-Chem Pharmacies. They are both able to continue trading through the lockdown, although for essential items only. This means that panic buying has likely seen good top-line growth for both, but there are negative margin implications, and Clicks Group's non-pharmacy retail businesses are closed. Please take a moment to read through the disclaimer. The slide pack for this presentation is available for you to download. You are welcome to use any of the information or graphics for your own purposes, so long as you reference the source. Also, please type any questions you have into the chat box. I'll stop at regular intervals to answer any questions. So let's jump right into it. We're going to touch on where South Africa's pandemic is right now. Then we'll quickly review the conditions under which both groups continue to operate in lockdown and what the profitability implications are. To be clear, we'll stress test the IAS standard reported numbers for 2019 and apply a range of assumptions that I'll talk you all through. So these numbers are explicitly not forecasts. Then we'll look at where to from here and also raise some questions that I don't necessarily have answers to right now. Lastly, we'll sum up the investment cases for you. So, where is South Africa right now? I'm sure you're all keeping updated with the current statistics. As of yesterday in South Africa, there were 4,793 identified COVID-19 cases. 1,473 people have happily recovered, and 90 people have sadly died. But this is backward looking, and I'd recommend you all read Professor Karim's article in this morning's Business Day, if you haven't already. We're now going to take a closer look at what a pharmacy selling only essential items in a lockdown situation actually looks like. Both Clicks Group and Dis-Chem Pharmacies are open for business during the lockdown, but they may only sell essential items, including medicines, PPE such as face masks, ordinary skincare, and personal hygiene products. Items that are specifically excluded include cosmetics, fragrances, and electrical equipment. Both retailers appear to be operating with shorter trading hours as a result of staff public transport constraints, and both have indicated that they have increased frontline staff pay. This is not across the board, as non-essential staff have been placed on leave and/or unpaid leave. There are some differences between the two groups in terms of what lockdown trading looks like. For Clicks Group, about 18% of its store numbers relate to Musica, The Body Shop, and Claire. These stores are all closed during lockdown as they sell non-essential products. Clicks Group stopped disclosing the other retail segments separately some time ago. I estimate that they account for around 10% of the retail segment sales, but they could well be less. I think it is quite possible that the COVID-19 impact on the economy will mean that Musica simply is no longer viable and will close. In contrast, Dis-Chem Pharmacy's Pharmacy First approach means that every store sells essential items and so has stayed open to trade. The exception has been the stores where staff members have tested positive for COVID-19 and the store has been closed for deep cleaning. There has been media criticism that these stores have not closed for long enough, but that is not part of our conversation for today. These charts show the category mix within the Clicks chain and Dis-Chem's retail business. While the two groups do not disclose directly comparable categories, Dis-Chem's dispensary business is a larger contributor to overall sales than Clicks, which is why its trading density is higher than Clicks, but the profitability is lower. As I'll show you shortly, I estimate that around 75% of Dis-Chem's business could be classified as essential, with Clicks' essential component at around 69%. To be very clear, the removal of certain non-essential categories from ongoing trade has, I think, some important profitability consequences for both groups. We know that the capped dispensing fee regime means that the gross margin in the dispensary segment is low. I estimate around 16 to 18%. In both cases, I have assumed 17% for the sake of the exercise I'm about to talk you through. The Clicks Group's retail division reported a 28.3% gross margin in financial 19. If I assume that the Clicks chain is 90% of the division's sales and that the other retail component of Musica, The Body Shop, and Claire has a 40% gross margin, this then implies that the Clicks chain's gross margin is 27%. This in turn implies that the non-pharmacy component has a gross margin of around 31.5%. Similarly, Dis-Chem reported a financial year 2019 gross margin of 23.4% in its retail business. Again, if we assume that this dispensary gross margin is 17%, then the rest of the business operates on a gross margin of an estimated 26.9%. By the way, if this is correct, then it provides some support to the thesis that Dis-Chem's essential mix is higher than Clicks if you assume that the gross margin in essential categories is lower than in non-essential categories. Okay, I'm going to stop here for questions before we move on to looking at the meat of what the lockdown means for earnings. Okay, you're all being very quiet. Let's move on then. Here is a brief outline of the key assumptions I've used in the profitability test. The first and arguably most important is how long the lockdown continues. Given that South Africa has put a further 4 lockdown stages on the drawing board and that the army has been deployed until June, I've assumed in these numbers that it will be 3 months. The second key assumption is that the economy is already in recession and that increased unemployment will translate into a sharp slowdown in the high sales growth rates of medicines and essential items that we've seen so far, especially if hoarding accounted for a significant part of the early increase. In both cases, we've assumed that half of the personal care category is classed an essential and that some staff have been placed on unpaid leave. We have assumed some rental relief, but think that Dis-Chem's intention to pay no rent will face serious legal challenges, especially as the courts are now explicitly requiring both landlords and tenants to practice Ubuntu. We've assumed that the tax rate will be the same as last year. In other words, no emergency budget measures that could see tax rates increase. And the last important point is that we've done both on the IAS accounting treatment to strip out the noise that the change to IFRS 16 has caused. Right, moving on to the key assumptions for the Clicks group. The group no longer discloses Musica and The Body Shop separately, and it only started clear after it changed its disclosure. I've assumed that all 3 of these businesses combined are about 10% of the division's revenue, and that the Clicks chain itself accounts for 90%. Within the Clicks chain itself, I'm assuming that 31% of its financial 19 sales has been classified as non-essential. I'm assuming that both UPD and the dispensary grow 10%, and that the dispensary gross margin is 17%. Most of Clicks Group's other income is logistics fees earned by UPD. So I've assumed that this comes under some pressure through government intervention to reduce the price increases of medicines because of the currency depreciation. And so I've increased other income by 5%. I've penciled in 75% rent reductions for Musica, The Body Shop, and Claire, and assumed that rent costs for the Clicks chain reduced by 25%. The other key assumption is that not paying non-essential staff will largely cancel out the increases paid to frontline essential staff. And then, as you see, I've also used a decline of minus 10% in other costs and assumed that interest earned declines by minus 20% as margins come under pressure and more cash is tied up in inventory that can't be sold. And lastly, I'm assuming that Solvay's associate contribution will halve. Moving on to Dis-Chem, the core assumption is that 75% of its sales are in essential products and that there will be some gross margin erosion on essential goods because of increased warehouse staff costs. Similar to Clicks, I've assumed other income increases just 5%, that ultimately Dis-Chem will get 25% off its rent, and that this will offset the increases paid to staff. Interest earned will be down 20% and interest paid up 10%. Okay, so this is where the financial rubber hits the road. To be clear, these are not forecasts, but a stress test of what financial 2019 income statements would have looked like under the assumptions named. Even with relatively robust growth in medicines and essential goods, Clicks Group's turnover could have notionally declined. The bigger mix of medicines and less contribution from other retail would have reduced the overall gross margin as well. The net result is that earnings would have declined just under 12%. Given our assumption that Dis-Chem Pharmacies product mix contains a higher proportion of essential items and that its retail business is all pharmacy, it's no surprise that it appears to be more defensive than Clicks Group. Okay, so moving on to where to from here. I just want to highlight a couple of the key questions that I think investors should be asking. The first and most important is how long the lockdown will last. In China, Wuhan was completely locked down for 76 days, and even now certain restrictions remain in place. The second element is whether the tough economic conditions that the lockdown has exacerbated will continue to pressure the independent pharmacy sector and accelerate their de facto creation of a corporate pharmacy duopoly. And my last question is whether these two groups, who have both continued to expand their store footprints reasonably aggressively, if they continue to expand, or will they slow their new store rollouts from here? Right, so we are getting close to wrapping things up. Here are a couple more questions that I think we need to consider in formulating the investment cases for these two retailers. The most fundamental question is what the long-term implications of the lockdown are for the economy and the South African consumer story. The length of the lockdown will determine how many small businesses survive, and so the impact on unemployment. The second question relates to the social media storms currently surrounding Dis-Chem Pharmacies' response to the lockdown. Public opinion expressed on social media hasn't responded well to events such as the group refusing to pay rent and for alleged price gouging. It remains to be seen whether this outrage translates into people actually choosing to shop elsewhere or whether it blows over. The other question is whether the profitability of both distribution businesses could be impaired by government finally implementing a cap on logistics fees. This has supposedly been on the table for well over a decade, but has never implemented. The effect of currency depreciation on medicine prices could be a catalyst for this, as government could choose to reduce the distribution fee or the logistics fees in order to mitigate some of the currency-related increases in medicine prices that the ACP will need to cover. Clicks Group's trailing PE expanded from high single digits in 2007 to current levels of around 32 times and has been as high as 40 times. This was driven both by its remarkable turnaround, but also by foreign investors who were willing to pay more for the quality than local fund managers generally. Now, however, South Africa's economic woes may cause some of these foreign investors to question this, and at the end of February, foreign investors owned 71% of the group. And the last question, which has no clear answer yet because it will depend on whether suppliers absorb the effects of currency depreciation on the cost of goods to support volumes, or whether they will try to protect margins or a combination of the two. So how much inflation will come through? Right, let's think what this means for your investment portfolios. Given what I've previously said about the Clicks Group's high PE rating being driven by foreign shareholders that might now want to reduce their South African exposure further, it will be no surprise that I think the share price remains vulnerable. Also, I think there is a reasonable chance that the INEC consensus for fully diluted HEPS growth of 5.5% for financial 20 will prove too optimistic, even as I am conscious that its H1 saw fully diluted HEPS up 14.4% and had no COVID-19 impact. Dis-Chem looks slightly more defensive than Clicks Group overall. As I've mentioned, there have been some PR missteps, and the group will need to improve its relationship with the customers, who may be somewhat disenchanted. One of the group's long-term growth strategies has been to move into smaller cities and towns where it has not previously operated. It will be interesting to see if this changes in a post-COVID-19 world. Right, let's just finish up here. So just to reiterate, the PE ratings seem high, especially if you're open to the idea that the -6% real GDP declines that we're seeing forecast at the moment may prove to be too optimistic as the lockdown is extended. The most interesting question must be whether Clicks Group uses this opportunity to exit Musica entirely. And for the first time in a decade, some local fund managers may find it attractive if we see further share price slides. Dis-Chem seems more defensive than Clicks Group. However, it also has a high trailing PE of 33.5 times, despite not having met consensus earnings expectations since listing in November 2016. Its relatively low liquidity may now also exacerbate any price moves, and the management team still needs to clarify its succession plans for CEO Ivan Salzman. Are there any more questions? No. Thank you all for taking the time to attend, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.